Okay. Faith, you want to share one with us?
Sure. Using equipment, either manipulatives or in the science lab.
Okay. Suzanne?
Hands-on experiments.
Okay. Anna?
Inquiry.
Okay. Michael?
Investigation for a solution.
Okay. All right, so we have an inventory for you that looks like this. Sarah, would you like to point that out in their notebook there?
So it is very close to the misalignment directions there. In fact, it's the
What
very next
section?
page. Isn't under leadership. So just past where we were earlier, one page past should do it.
Now, there is a mistake on here, and that it has no date. We regularly edit things, and so we will put, in fact, I have a couple of edits as I was going through this last night, about 10:30, and I know we need to move this here, etc. And so look for dates on things. So it may look like it's the same, but there's something that's going to be edited on it, right? So this is what we have gathered through what the research says are what our best practices from our discipline. They are divided into best practices for math, for science, those that are both math and science, and then the things that are specific to principles. And there's overlap in this, and then there are, of course, some general things like questioning that we mentioned earlier. So what do we know about science? So here are the ones that are listed in science. So the first one that I'm going to talk to you about is the meta-analysis. So Sarah, you want to point out the meta-analysis that's going to be in Lilac?
Yep,
What
it's
section?
in the science section, very first page.
That is a study that when Governor Perry said we're going to focus on science, I was on the statewide committee, and I said we do not have an overall document that has identified the best practices as per the research. So Texas funded a meta-analysis, and A&M did it, and this is the results of it. So they went through all of the research papers about what does effective science look like in effective classrooms, and so they came up with this meta-analysis. So what you see there is you see them ranked. This is my chart. I've taken everything and tried to, and I'm giving you the citation there at the top of it. And the ranking is also to the right. I've given the effect size in case you care. So the first one is enhanced context. So you'll notice that it's things like using your schoolyard. It's looking at things that can be it's not a textbook example. It's something that is enhanced either with field trips or out in the schoolyard, or using concrete models or phenomena like hurricanes, things like that that are going to happen. So that's enhanced context, the #1 improvement in student learning. #2, collaborative learning. Well, duh. #3, questioning. So even in science, so it's universal, but we know specifically for science it's important. Inquiry, #4. So what is inquiry? We're going to come back to that toward the end of the day today, but we know that inquiry enables students to understand science concepts better. Manipulation strategy. So they are manipulating things. It could be models, it could be any kind of labs where they're handling things, so any kind of physical manipulation, and that's going to link back to what we're going to talk about in another handout that you have. Testing strategies, again, that's generic, but we know that it improves with students. So testing strategies could be in the form of the formative questions that occur during a discussion, during instruction. So all the way from formative to summative, using different types of testing strategies, the kind of feedback that students might need. Can you explain what you mean by that answer? So all kind of questioning and testing are going to kind of link there. Notice instructional technology is #7. It's not the silver bullet, but this actually means that students are using the technology as well. So it's not just the teachers, but students using the instructional technology, which will also fit with another handout later. And then enhanced materials. What that means is if I hand you a lesson, Michael, and say, here, go do that lesson, it is not going to be as effective if I say, here's an idea, use it. So you take it, you change it to make it yours. Your students are going to learn more than if you just mimic someone else's lesson. It may be ownership. We don't know why. We only know that these are correlations. They're not causation. They're only correlations. Then down at the bottom, it says direct instruction. So they did not look at any studies because they didn't fit the criteria for the meta-analysis. So you don't see direct instruction up there in that list. There is evidence that direct instruction is effective. However, most of what we see is not really a direct instructional model. It's more teacher-centered. It's not direct instructional where they actually have the input and modeling, the guided practice, and the independent practice like it's supposed to be, with the questioning and all these other components with it. But we know that the research tells us that direct instruction is effective for learning skills or processes. If I want you to learn how to use a triple beam balance, which Denise Kern, I think, tells her story about that. She'd never even seen a triple beam balance when she went through the summer PD, and she was just fascinated by it. So the idea, of her learning how to use a triple beam balance, she's going to learn it more quickly and understand it better if I just say, okay, you're going to put the weight on 0 and you're going to make sure it's balanced out, and then you're going to do this and do that and do this. So direct instruction for a process or use of a skill or a piece of equipment. So that can fit into an inquiry lesson if they're going to use a piece of equipment. So you should be seeing direct instruction for that. It shouldn't be just throw the piece of equipment out there necessarily, although that can be. Remember, these are not laws, these are just general guidelines there. And then I've explained effect size for some people who didn't understand effect size in there. So that's the meta-analysis. And actually, Sarah, is there a copy of the observation instrument in here?
So
Could you guide us to that?
Flip back to leadership. It's about the fourth component.
Our observation. Keep turning on. Nope. Nope. Oh, there it is, second one, observation form. So if you turn over to page 2 of that observation form, it doesn't have it. Yeah. So if you turn on to page 2, you will notice that same list of effective strategies. We think it fits for math and science. So when we come out and visit with your teachers, it's not an evaluative visit, it's a mentoring time. That these are the things that we look for, and these are the topics of conversation with the teachers after we make the observation with them, the debriefing. And I will be coming back to that. Go ahead.
I was going to say, you'll notice a few additional items there at the bottom.
Well, yes, I'm sorry, yeah. So after enhanced material, you see direct instruction, because it should be there in some lessons. So we've added direct instruction, we've added student engagement, the learning objectives aligned with the standards and language accuracy. So when Brownie and I were out in the classrooms, we said, wait a minute, there's something wrong with this lesson, it's not on the list. So these are some things that we have added, to the list that do have a research base for that.
And you said that was both for math and science.
Mm-hmm. And it may fit other disciplines, we don't know, we're just saying all we're talking about is math and science.
So, thank you.
Yeah. All right, now I'd like for you to look at that Rennie opportunity to learn.
So it is purple, it's in leadership. Let's see, where are you?
It's in purple?
It is purple. What's in here?
Just say Rennie study. Keep going.
Is that one maybe just science? Research findings, question? Oh, I'm sorry, it's under science.
Under science. Go back.
It's specific
Go
to
forward.
science. It's the third item in science.
Okay. So this came out of the Rennie Center for Educational Research and Policy. And if you want to look at the chart, I'm kind of a math science kind of person, so I immediately go to the chart rather than the words. that if you look at it, you will notice that the first one is talking about what they found in high-performing schools in science compared with low-performing. So the first one there is in teaching. So in high-performing schools, you'll notice that they said that the teachers were more likely to have roles created for them with specialized science knowledge, and that most high-performing teachers were solely responsible for teaching science in one grade. That's in elementary. We had a question, Anna went with us to the TEPSA, we presented at TEPSA, and there was a question about that because in another chart we have suggested that that it not be departmentalized below grade 5. And the feeling that I have is you have to consider the child. If you don't have a family relationship, you shouldn't be moving kids around every which way. They're children, you know, they're young children. So that would be my recommendation, is to not have them, they're looking at science scores, but I think there's more to life than looking at science scores.
Could
And then-
you, I'm sorry, could you have a specialized teacher in science on the grade level who helps guide science instruction?
Sure, you bet.
Because that, I would see that that would help.
Oh, absolutely, because again, most elementary teachers are not comfortable with science. One of the best programs I've ever seen was at a school somewhere out in the U.S., I've forgotten where, but they had like a fifth grade lab, but they also had an outside science area, and they had a science instructional specialist that just stayed in that lab, and so kids would rotate in there. I don't know how often they would do that. Pretty often, probably every 3-4 weeks maybe. But every teacher, every grade level teacher had a FOSS kit. So they taught science in their classroom, but they also got this extra science with a specialist. And that's probably the strongest one that I have seen. So, you know, they're not rotating into that science teacher who, you know, if I'm teaching high school, I'm going to have 150 kids. How can I know 150 children? You cannot. So, especially elementary level. So, you know, those are the kind of things that y'all should have conversations about. Look at what the research says, etc. And then in high school, they had more science teachers than low-performing schools. So they scored better in science. Also more likely to have all the science classes taught by certified teachers in that discipline. So they were not a science teacher, they were a physics teacher, etc. And then on school leadership, and we'll get into this a little bit later on, but the leaders valued and prioritized science in most high performers, and were more likely to mandate and encourage science-related professional development. Trade math for that. You think that'd be the same? Now, math typically is prioritized because it's tested, but if you want children to learn science also, then it has to be prioritized. And encourage science-related professional development. We hear from teachers, our teachers, and you know, teachers outside of mix, they get very discouraged when they're a 5th grade science teacher and they're required to go to reading professional development, for example. They just don't see the value. I have no idea whether it's valuable or not, but they do not see the value. They feel like it's a waste of time. There are things they want to learn, but they're not, they're thrown into some generic thing. So
Our kids can't read, they can't read the science vocabulary though, that's even at a higher level.
what I'm saying is, though, if that's important, they need to be,
It's not being communicated.
it's not being communicated. It's not, and they just feel like it's a waste of their time. These schools were more likely to have regular access to district coordinators, scheduled to co-teach lessons, provide on-site PD each week. So you see that a lot in larger districts. It's harder, you know, for smaller districts to do that. But you have teachers on your campus who can do at least some of this. And then science teachers had more preparation time. Duh. Teaching science is like teaching, having a double load, because you have all of the labs and field things that you have to prepare for, all the equipment that goes along with that, and the materials, and you've got the prepping, and then you've got the cleaning up, and then you've got the putting up, and you know, to be able to do that, it takes time. There are particularly elementary teachers, I don't see this in secondary so much, but I've had elementary teachers tell me that their principals have made them leave at 4 o'clock. They don't consider that they need time to prep and clean up and store and organize and whatever for science. You can't leave campus at 4 o'clock. I never left, well, rarely left my campus at 4 o'clock, certainly in high school. It was usually me and the custodians and the coaches that were there, you know, at 5:30. And then the financial support, they had more money, duh, because then they could buy materials, they could have different ways of purchasing materials. We're going to talk about that a little bit later, about some things that need to be done. Elementary students or teachers typically do not have stuff to teach science with. That's one of the reasons why we made that list. And some of it can come from homes, you know, like the egg cartons, etc. But some of it you need to buy. And what we have seen is that when principals use the materials, they see the value of purchasing it. It just is an automatic thing that happens with our principals. And then, of course, in high school, we talked about the electronic ballots earlier. They need bigger budgets. When I was in Northeast School District, I was the department chair for 6 years at Madison High School. I had a $12,000 budget every year for science.
What did you say?
$12,000 every year for science.
Rich school, obviously.
Well, obviously,
For the whole year.
The whole year, every day.
again, I'm going to go back. We can have $60 million athletic complexes, and we can't buy science and materials.
I can't even get my building cleaned the way I want to once it's August, because the football field comes first. Painting the lines.
Yeah.
Your AP was scrubbing the carpet when I went to
Yes,
campus the other day. I was like, what are you doing?
Non-financial resources for the elementary ones, they had more than 60 minutes of science per week than low performing.
That's pretty low.
The hard shell. I'm sorry.
I think they're dumping that sometimes too.
But per week. That's not per day, that's per week.
Oh, that's per
right?
week.
That's why I was like, wow.
Gotcha.
I mean, there are many schools
so
that have no
doable.
science. I mean,
That's
they have no
crazy.
science at all, except 5th grade. So suddenly they've got science in 5th grade, and the 5th grade teacher is expected to teach K-4 peaks. The parent involvement, advocacy, greater or high-performing schools, duh. But that doesn't have to be dichotomous with income. I mean, there are, you know, poor parents. Many of them want to help their children. You know that. You work with them. They just don't know how.
Exactly.
They do not know how. They don't understand the importance of conversations with preschoolers to, you know, build that vocabulary before they come in. When I was teaching Montessori with our little 2.5-year-olds, we talk about put your hand above the table and put your hand below the table. You know, just simple things like that, those kind of conversations. We did.
That's cool.
Yeah. I taught Montessori for 8.5 years, and I learned a lot about a lot of things. You know, part of it is that advocacy, and I think the kind of things that Anna was talking about earlier with her science night, that gives them some insight about things to do. And even some of the things that I send out to you about what the American Pediatric Association says about screen time. Those things need to be in the summertime one that I sent out to you, some summertime ideas.
And it's so funny when you say about the low socioeconomic. If I think back to the parents that were there, it wouldn't have been the parents that I would have expected. You know, like the more educated, like the parents whose kids were,
Perform well.
yeah, it was just,
Yeah, and that tells you a lot. I mean, it's hard to have those kind of nights, parent nights. It's a lot of work. I think to have those early in the year really is part of building that relationship and that community of practice among, within a school and the parent population. Placement, high performers in high school are more likely offered the option of placement in advanced courses and offering advanced courses. And then enrichment activities, it talks about high school, but we know that's also true, for K-8, those kind of enrichment activities. There are too many times, especially, I'm sorry to say, that we have science classrooms that it's all about vocabulary. That is not science. You can walk this hallway, there are, 40 biologists in this building. You will not see one of them with flip cards memorizing vocabulary. That does not happen. And that's not science. Anyway, so, this would give you some considerations, if you would, about, why it's important to think about giving students the opportunity to learn science. You also have a document called the History of National Standards that Sarah's also going to point out to you where it's
That
located.
should be just before the TEKS, towards the end of leadership. Looks like
Yeah,
this.
we got it right there, there's a T. Don't you love those foldable teaks?
I do.
Love those.
Oh, you just passed it. It's just past the start date.
Okay, so what this is to demonstrate to the world that we have had a long history of national science standards. The earliest ones that I could start with was 1989, so that was Science for All Americans from the American Association of Advancement of Science. So we've had these iterations of standards. There is no Common Core science. There are people who try to link the next generation science standards that you see down there at the bottom with Common Core. It is not Common Core. It's just the next iteration of our national standards. These were written by us, by science teachers, by scientists, by science educators. They're not written by some outside entity being hired to do so. So the idea that there is a history of standards, and I don't know what kind of conversations y'all get about Common Core, but there is no Common Core science. NGSS is not Common Core. It's just our next iteration. And we will be using the last two there, the framework for K-12 science education and the next generation science standards. We will be using those extensively. We'll also be going back and using some of the older ones. The third one, 1993, is the benchmarks for science literacy. And then there, the 1996, the National Science Education Standards. And then the last two are really, they look like the TEKS. I mean, they explain science, and if you don't understand a TEKS, you need to go back and look at these standards because it can help you understand the science, the content with it. And we'll show you that with the lesson planning format that we're going to show you later. Okay, NAEP, Sarah, where is that one? That NAEP study?
It is also purple. Let's see. It's gonna be right. So it is, okay, so just a few pages before the standards. You'll see the FAIR model.
What standards?
The, I'm sorry, the history of standards. It looks like this. It's towards the end. It's maybe about 3 or 4.
And what is the title?
What is the impact of decline in science instructional time in elementary schools? Let's pass that. Yeah. Yeah, it's just past reading in the disciplines. 2 more. Yeah, should be it. Yeah, there we go.
All right, so what you see, if you look at the third bullet, that's the one I've highlighted, states with higher average classroom time on science show a pattern of higher NAEP scores. NAEP, as you know, is a National Assessment for Educational Progress, and it is a nice measure where states can be compared, and thus those with more classroom time with hands-on science activities have higher NAEP scores. That tells me that NAEP's a nice assessment for science. So I would like for you to think about, how does your district assess? I know some of your teachers have complained that the person who is putting together or has put together the science benchmarks doesn't really understand what's being taught, so there are TEKs that are being tested in the benchmarks that are not in the scope and sequence, so they're not in the sequence, or they're not a good assessment for that particular TEK.
Well, those are out the door, the teachers' resource.
So, yeah, because they will have. But you need to look for the same thing. Nothing is going to be perfect, and that's why knowing that content and pedagogy is a foundation for, testing all of these things. Don't even listen to me unless you have measured it with something. What does the research say, and what is specific for STEM? And you call me on it if you see something that's different than what you're seeing in the research. But my job is to keep up with that and to allow that with you. But again, the idea of hands-on, it makes a big difference. Okay, safety overcrowding, we're going to come back to that a little bit later on. The NSES changing emphasis, Sarah?
I believe that one is under science, and it's 1, 2, 3, 4.
Okay, so this is from the National Science Education Standards, which, if you will remember, is about 1998. But if you, no, it's this one. Yeah, it's this one. So what it says is not any different than we've always said, and it's not any different than what we're saying today. So it's less emphasis on facts and information and more emphasis on understanding. So if you just look at that first bullet. Because what we know is inquiry is a proven method to understand natural phenomena, to understand patterns in nature. We know it works. We know tricks don't work, mnemonics don't work, memorizing vocabulary does not lead to understanding. It's learning by doing, learning by figuring it out as they go with what those patterns are. So what that tells me as an administrator is I'm going to be looking at that right-hand column. That's what I should be looking for and encouraging my teachers to do. And again, it's not every lesson should be an inquiry lesson, and not all parts of the lesson necessarily are going to be inquiry. So if you look in the second half there, more emphasis on activities that investigate and analyze science questions, investigations over a long period of time. It's interesting, we're seeing this big push on PBLs. We did PBLs 30, 40 years ago. In fact, some of the ones they're doing today are the very same ones that we did before. But not all PBLs are equal. Some of them are great and some of them are awful. Just because it says a PBL does not mean it's like technology. It doesn't mean that it's good. That's why that foundation of content and pedagogy has to make a difference with that. The process skills in context, that means you don't teach the process skills separate from the content. If they're supposed to be measuring, trying to think something in elementary, I'm thinking high school biology, we measure cell size or something like that. That, we teach measurement when they have to use measurement. I know in the middle school at Lockhart, they were teaching measurement as the first 2 weeks, all of this measurement, using all this equipment. I said, why? They're not going to remember it 6 months later when they have to use that piece of equipment. That's a waste of instructional time. Why would you do that? And they just always done it. So what I'm teaching your teachers is question things. Go back to best practices, go back to the research and see if it makes sense. I can see why it might make sense in some instance. You know, I've taught in bigger schools, so they did a lot of moving around the students the first 2 weeks, so you had the teachers in the same course teach the same lesson, so to speak, pretty much. So if a kid had to move to another teacher's class, it wasn't an issue. So, you know, there are all kinds of considerations that you have to make. But to teach things in isolation, teach in particular process skills, and I don't know that that's true for math. I'm not going to say that. I don't know that. We'll have to ask Browning that question. But I know it's true in science. And it's an old recommendation. 1998 this is. So it's not any different. I don't see anything any different than it is today of what we're asking students to do. Okay, there are in your TEKS a requirement for different kinds of scientific research designs, and I'm going to go into a little bit later on. In K5, or K4, it's only descriptive. We do descriptive investigations here. You'll see posters in the hallway where we have biologists go into an area and they'll do surveys of, you know, how many black-winged cormorants are found in that particular site. That's descriptive investigations. That's not baby stuff. You start with that. And we'll talk about it a little bit later. At the 5th grade, they had the 5th grade team kept getting things wrong. We kept correcting it, and they would go back to the wrong thing. What your 5th grade students should be doing is all 3 of those. And we'll have some instruction with with the teachers about these types of research designs and when you use which type. And later on this afternoon, I'm going to go into it with some more different specifics with it. But in your 5th grade TEKS, it says only experimental. It should say descriptive and comparative as well as experimental. In your TEKS resource system, they do not have descriptive and comparative.
Anywhere?
Well, it's in the TEKS, but they don't have, they've got one, it almost looks like a science fair process that they go through. I can show it to you, but it's only experimental. It's not, I'd have to look at it more specifically, but they don't have descriptive or comparative in there. And your kindergartners should be doing descriptive. You know, they can have a bird feeder on the window, and every 10 minutes from 8 until 8:30 or 9 o'clock, they would look at the timer and see what birds were there. In the morning, what do they see at 9 o'clock? What do they see at noon? What do they see at 2 o'clock? Those are descriptive studies. And there's lots of things like that that K-12 should be doing and that we do at the university level. People tend to think it's just observations. Observations are the heart of science. If you told scientists they couldn't make observations, I mean, they would laugh at ignorant, an ignorant statement like that. But we have people who testify at the state level about things like that. Yes, I'll tell you later. It's coming up. Okay, the 5E model, the BSCS 5E model. So Sarah, what page is that?
It is the 2nd page in science.
2nd page in science. I have to pay you a fee here, observation fee. All right, so in general, this is the 5E model, as you probably know. And a 5E lesson can be taught in 15 minutes, it can be taught in 3 hours. There is no limit to it. You don't put a round peg into a square hole, so to speak. So you don't make artificial decisions about, oh, I'm going to do this in a 5E. Well, maybe. If it's a concept, it's more likely to be successful, or your students if you use an inquiry model. There are versions of a 5E. I actually like a 6E. And the 6E, after the elaboration, would have an explanation time with it, where students are explaining their understanding of that elaboration activity. I've seen a 7E. So again, if you know the fundamentals, then you can kind of make it fit. So one lesson might need a 5E, another lesson might need a 7E, and another lesson might need a 6E. But the fundamentals have to be there. You still have to have students explain their understanding. You have to have them writing, you have to have them talking to each other, learning collaboratively. All of those have to be in play when you're making decisions about how the lesson should be designed. In most all of these cases, if you look over what is inconsistent with the model, you'll notice that they're not looking for the right answer, and they're not offering the right answer. I see a lot of bell ringers at the beginning. Gives the answer to the question that they're supposed to be inquiring about. I know.
That doesn't make any sense.
I know, that's what I'm thinking when I'm sitting there. And if I'm in the classroom, I have that conversation with the teacher afterwards. The way I like to debrief is the same way I do with my students, is I have the teacher tell me, well, what do you think worked well? What's your learning objective? What worked well on the lesson? What didn't work well on the lesson? Because my job is to help people reflect on their own instruction, not for me coming in and telling them what was right or wrong. I can do that, but that's not good for them. That's not good for their children. It's for them to think it through and for me to ask the right questions to get them to do that. So ultimately, I'm going to get to that. And they'll look at the chart, that we use, did the lesson do this, did the lesson do that, so they can start getting a better handle of what best practices are. In the exploration, an exploration is simply finding out an answer, finding a pattern. You do not know the answer in an inquiry. You find out the answer in an inquiry. So at our level, the question might be, the research question is, what kind of black-winged cormorants are found in this area? In yours, it might be, what kind of birds come at 9 o'clock at the bird feeder? That's the research question. And the teacher doesn't tell them, well, what I've seen is, at 9 o'clock it's these birds, and at noon it's these birds, or what have you. The exploration is the time when the student defines their own operational definition, their understanding of what that pattern is, in their own words. Then the teacher's not telling them what the pattern is. If the students are not understanding what the pattern or being able to identify it, it could be that the lesson is not structured, so it enables students to do that. It could be things that this teacher says or doesn't say. I have seen teachers say they're going to teach an inquiry lesson. We see this in our class. And they'll start out with a learning objective, or they'll tell them what the answer is, the pattern is, and then they'll start the inquiry. Well, no. But I have them 100 hours, so at the end of that 100 hours, they've got it, right. And the explanation is a lot of student talk. It's not teacher talk. It's not the teacher lecturing. It's not the teacher explaining the concept. It's the students explaining the concepts in their own words. And at some point, you get to the academic vocabulary, but it's at the end. Students do not need to have the definition of a word and do not understand the concept if they only know the definition. That's abstract. There's no context for understanding for it. So they have to do it, they have to understand it, and then we can name it. Then we name the concept, then we can give them the academic vocabulary, the scientific definition or the formal definitions of what you're going to talk about. The elaboration simply means that they're either going to deepen or broaden their understanding. I'm going to go back to the bird feeders. So you have a bird feeder on this is the west side of our building here. So you've got a bird feeder on the west side. So if you're looking at patterns of bird feeding at 9 and noon and 2 or something like that, then another question might be, well, this is the west side. Is that going to be the same pattern it is in a classroom on the east side? So that would be like their elaboration. So they're either deepening or broadening their understanding of this particular question. And then the evaluation is, as we said, it's not just the summative, it's the formative, it's all those open-ended questions. et cetera, that students are demonstrating their understanding of it, and hopefully in different contexts. If they're understanding that pattern in the natural world, that's what science is about, understanding patterns in the natural world. It is not about memorizing vocabulary. I cannot say that enough. That just kills kids' desire for science. We particularly do that at secondary level. In fact, that's how I got into my position today. I started my PhD while I was still teaching high school, and I got into the NAEP data. You know how when you're in your degrees, they put you into the literature, into the research, which is what we're supposed to do. And I saw the NAEP data, and you know the NAEP data assesses students at grades 4, 8, and 12 approximately. Well, at the 4th grade, students, most of them, high number, 90s, 98%, like science and say they do well in science because they work hard. 8th grade, all of a sudden you've got this huge population, probably 30%, saying they don't like science that much, and if they do well in science, it's because it's luck. They're lucky. They no longer feel like they can do science, that they can learn science because we've made it undoable, unlearnable, mysterious. And that's our fault. So, after 10 years actually, because I taught in Houston too, 10 years of teaching high school, I said, middle school, I gotta go to middle school. That's where I have to try to recapture their hearts in science. So that's how I ended up with such a focus on middle school because of the NAEP data. And elementary is just, it's just really critical because that's 4th grade. We're still 5th grade. Are we going to kill it for 5th grade star? We don't need to, I don't think. Okay, so what is similar in both science and math? Well, we have the college and career readiness standards. When we were writing the TEKS, all of the TEKS in science, we, even 5th grade, looked at the college and career readiness standards. So all of us tend to look at that as a culminating understanding of certain concepts. They're kind of generic, they're broad. Question, comment? No, okay. And then the lesson planning preparation format. Sarah, where is that for us?
That is under leadership. And it's maybe the 4th quarter or so, just past the observation point.
Is it pink, right?
It's pink.
It's pink, which means that's something that we have created. So what I have found particularly, and it's been pretty much with me working with my students, because in my course, I do not let them plan a lesson because they don't know how to plan a lesson. Too many times in C&I courses, they're told to plan a lesson. They have no clue. They don't know what best practices are. So I don't let them do it. We do collaboratively planned lessons. We assign either a TEKS or a learning objective. They do 3 of them. And we collaboratively plan it. They team teach it. We videotape it. They go out in the hallway after the lesson, and the teaching team sits in the hallway and says, what went well, what didn't go well, and they write that out and they hand it back to me. And then the students that are in the class do their same kind of reflection. What did they think went well in the lesson? What should you keep? What should you toss? And they keep that for future discussion. Then the videotape goes online, and each person in the team views their teaching videos by themselves. They write an online reflection of what they think about it. And then they come back to the building for the next class, and we have a computer lab, and they go down to the computer lab and sit there as a team with their earplugs in, looking at the lesson again as a team, and seeing what to keep, what to toss. Then they come back to class, and then they lead the discussion. The teaching team leads the discussion. Keep, toss, change, do this or that. Then the students, their colleagues, say what they think. Then the lab instructor goes, which in this case is Sarah, or sometimes Alexis is in there. I don't care who's in there. Anybody can come, and they can make comments on the lesson. They're going to be science teachers too. and then I go last. Well, my hope is always I don't have that much to say because the rest of them have figured it out. Sometimes it's not an inquiry lesson, and I know it's not, and I'm sitting there waiting, who's going to figure this one out? Well, that's always interesting. They do this 3 times. So by the time they have a 20-minute 2E lesson. I give them the same TEKS. We do a series, actually a chemistry series of middle school TEKS. And I give them the same TEKS to teach in a 3E because I found it's better for them to learn to revise a lesson than to give them a new TEKS with it. And then, so that's a 20-minute lesson, and then they go to a 3E because they have to add the evaluation with it. So they have an explore and explain for their 2E, explore, explain, evaluate for the 3E. And then I change into a series of concepts in natural selection because that's very poorly understood, very much mistaught. And they do about a 50 or 60-minute 5E lesson on natural selection it's a series of concepts that I assign to them. And I change up the teams. We talk about collaboration and attitude and all those kind of things. And then they go through the same thing about the hallway reflection, the single video reflection, the team video reflection, coming back and doing, so that they are learning how to be reflective about their own instruction. So in doing all of that, I found out they don't really know how to plan, and they don't know how to do what you might call the background, I guess, for it. So some of these people are they're biology majors. That means they've got 36 hours of biology, 24 hours of chemistry, 8 hours of physics, 6 hours of calculus. I mean, these are, they're pretty top notch. Rowan had a 3.75 biology major. I mean, they're good students. But they don't know how to do this. So we talked about, the importance, kind of teaching the importance or teaching the mechanics. So this is what we've created, and this is what they have to complete. And we are asking your teachers to take one lesson and create it this way. So they're going to put the lesson topic, which may be the same thing as the TEKS. And then what are the prerequisite math skills, and it may be an NA or not. And then what should the students be able to do at the end of the lesson? So they're thinking it through perhaps in some different ways with this. Then we're asking them to look at the science TEKS and compare it to those 4 standards that you see going across there, so that they will understand what that TEKS means. I have seen 7th grade science teachers teach the balanced photosynthesis equation, which is not in the TEKS. They don't need to know a balanced equation because the teacher was all cert and didn't understand the TEKS. And I hear a lot of principals say that their teachers don't understand the TEKS. Why do you say that? Do any of y'all think that?
I do. Like, I think, I'll give you one example.